Welcome to the podcast today. Today we have with us, we've switched over from the Senate. We're in the Congressional District 2 race. And we have with us today Colby Jenkins. Colby's running in Congressional District 2. I've got to know him pretty well over the campaign trail as well. Great guy. I'm glad to have him on here today. Colby, thanks for joining me.
You bet. Thanks, Carson. Good to see you again.
Yeah, it's always nice to see you. And so, Colby, before we get into this, why don't you give everybody a little background about yourself? Tell everybody a little about you, where you come from, why you got into this mess.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks, and good to see you again. As you were alluding to, we've been on the campaign trail together for months, and after the state convention, our paths have gone different ways. We've focused on different things. So I've missed seeing you and your wife. So it's good to
Yeah,
see you again.
same to you guys.
So a little about me. I'm a Utah native. I was born and raised in small town Roosevelt, Utah, out in the Uinta Basin, kind of eastern part of Utah. And then 31 years ago, I left Roosevelt to go to the United States Military Academy at West Point. That was where I first raised my hand and swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that time there at West Point, I was there for 2 years, and then I left for two and served a mission, a service mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Spent 2 years down in Brazil, and then went back to West Point and graduated, and that launched me into a career in the military. I was first an infantry officer. I was an airborne ranger leading an infantry platoon, and then 9/11 happened, and I knew that my career, my time in the army had changed, and that the nation would need me to do more. And so I got in the best shape of my life. I tried out for the special forces and became a Green Beret, and then immediately launched to combat. Went to Afghanistan fairly quickly, spent time there, came home, went to Paraguay, South America, did some counter drug work there, came home, and then went to Colombia, South America, spent time in the jungles there doing counter drug and a little bit of hostage rescue for Americans that were hostage there. And came out of that combat operational time, and my military command took a look at my experience and said, you've worked with a lot of tribal chiefs. You've had great success across different battlefields. So we've got a new battlefield for you. And they sent me to Washington, D.C.
That's the worst.
It's okay. They said, we got these tribal chiefs we want you to work with. So
Oof.
I became a Green Beret liaison, worked in Congress for a while, was in the Senate first and then over in the House, and then spent several years back in the Pentagon supporting the chairman and the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So at our senior levels as a legislative director, as a strategic advisor for several years, and in and around Washington, D.C. for about 9 years total. Actually even taught at the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington, taught legislative affairs in the evenings there. And so DC, the legislative process, how Congress works is this isn't my first rodeo. But came out of government. I'd been in the bowels of that bureaucracy, and I was suffocating. It was time to leave. And so I went to the corporate world and had some corporate world jobs and worked with fascinating people, worked on innovative problems with complex solutions. And that's really what brought us to where I'm at now at work. So we live in Utah. My wife and I are both natives, but our career in the military took us all over. And when COVID hit, we thought, what are we doing away from home? And so we found land here in St. George, and we built a house here next to my in-laws. And we've been here now going on 5 years almost, and it's been great.
No, that's
That that
but
gets me to almost. Oh, go ahead.
right. But you've been all over the world. You've been there. You've seen it. You've seen the tribal chiefs and the warlords. Why go back to Washington, D.C.? Why put yourself back at the middle of it? You just got out of it. Why put yourself back in the middle of it?
Yeah, great question. Why in the world would I do this? Yeah.
It's a
So really
terrible
the
thing.
fire, yeah, the fire really started kindling when we disgracefully withdrew from Afghanistan
Sure.
as an Afghan veteran, and I would never argue that Afghanistan was perfect. We've got 20 years of mistakes there, but seeing what our nation did there just left me with such a pit hole in my stomach, thinking, how in the world do we have leaders that think that that's okay, both both in uniform and outside? How can anyone think that that's okay? And what can I do about it? And that's when it started to churn in me. But I never thought, well, I'm going to run for Congress. I was just thinking, what does our nation come to, and what's next? And And then Chris Stewart resigned mid-cycle last year, and that kicked off the special election process. I had just started a new civilian job last April. So I was the national director. I was onboarding across the nation, getting my team up, and so there was no way I could jump into that special election.
Right.
But I was a precinct chairman at the time here. I was a state delegate. I'm a senior military veteran, so I thought I'll be a good citizen and I'll get involved. And so I got to know those 11 candidates, went to the debates. It produced Celeste Malloy. I learned all about her background after the fact and was upset like a lot of people, learning that, she wasn't a resident of Utah. She hadn't bothered to vote and wasn't a registered Republican, on and on. And then just seeing her votes in those early days, I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I was actually talking to a retired Green Beret mentor of mine, just kind of venting to him about state of the nation, what my district just produced, and wow, we've got to do better. And he said, Colby, no one's riding over the hill to save the day. You're a combat veteran, you're a Green Beret, you've led troops, you've bled for this nation. So what are you going to do about it? He was just chiding me. What are you going to do about it? And I said, well, I guess I'm running for Congress. And that was really the tipping point for me.
No, and I get that firsthand. And people always ask me, I kind of came out of nowhere. I actually ran against Chris Stewart in 2019, but it wasn't because I
Right.
didn't like Chris. It was something I just wanted to get into the game. And it's
Yeah.
easy to, and this was something I found, and it taught me a lesson that was pretty valuable. And it's easy to listen to other people. It's easy to have people tell you, this version's bad because of X, Y, and Z. It's easy to, drill in on those things. And I've publicly apologized to Chris for some of the things I said about him back then. But Chris has done a phenomenal job. And then again, it is what it is, but you have to get into the game. And I told people that the reason why I got in is I learned at a very young age, if you're going to complain about something, you have to be part of the solution. If you're not part of the solution, if you're not putting forward a solution, nobody wants to hear you complain and nobody's going to listen to you. And that's honestly, to me, how it should be, how it's going to be. And if we want to change this country, that's what's going to happen. There are going to have to be a lot of people who don't want to do this. And really, that to me is a gauge to a lot of this. When somebody asks me, why would you want to run for this? Why would you run for governor? I don't want to. That is not something that I want to do, but it's the right thing to do. And you put yourself in that position, you do everything you can, and then you let people decide. And at the end of the day, the voters, again, at convention, I came up 3 points shy of making it happen. Had we picked up 3 points in convention, it would have been a completely different race today. But it didn't. And we left it up to the voters and they made their choice. So now we've been a part of the solution. So now you've been in there. You understand how things work. You understand how the legislative process works. You get that. When you travel state, what are the biggest concerns that you hear from Utahns about what's happening right now?
Yeah, without fail. And thank you for your example of serving and leading our party. I mean, when I came back to Utah, you were the chairman, and so it's great to see your leadership right away. And so yeah, thank you
Thank you.
for not only just talking the talk, but you've actually walked it. So I appreciate that.
Thanks.
What I'm seeing, in our second district, we have 13 counties that range all the way from Kanab. It's almost like a boomerang, Kanab all the way up to Tooele, and then it cuts down into Bountiful and Centerville and Salt Lake. And so it's quite a diverse set of
Yeah.
counties and concerns. But the one concern I hear without fail, and I've done 60 plus events over the last few months throughout every county, is what am I going to do to close the border? What
Yeah.
what can you do to close the border? And we hear stories. Even I was in Delta a little over a week ago, and had one of the leaders tell me about how they've had buses come into the middle of Delta, small town Delta, and drop off busloads of Peruvian illegal immigrants in
Wow.
Delta, middle of Utah. So it's everywhere. That all of our communities are being affected by that. So they want to know, what am I going to do to close that? What am I going to do to contribute to that? And then certainly with our district, like all of Utah, it's what can I do to help secure our water and land? How can
Yeah.
I help the federal government away and help defend our local leaders so they can do what they need to do? And those are without a doubt that where I hear the most from our constituents.
And it's funny, it doesn't matter who you ask or traveling the state as a governor candidate or whatever it is. Those were always the top concerns that we had was public lands. It was the national debt, and then it was the southern border is always at the top of their list. And so when we talk about the southern border, it's easy to say, we've got a problem down there, right? Because we do. And at this point, I have no doubt that it is by design and it is made that way because you can't screw this up this bad on not on purpose. You
Yes.
can't make an accident that this bad. You've had to have had some calculation into why. And we can all speculate as to why that it's happening. But what can we do? Where would you start with the border? How being a military veteran, how would you say would be the best way to stop what's happening at the border?
Well, it begins with re-electing President Trump. Well,
Bingo.
leadership matters. Leadership truly matters here, and that's a key in terms of my race. A key distinction in my race is one of us voted for President Trump, and one of us did not. I voted for President Trump twice before, and I will vote for him again this time. My opponent didn't even bother to vote, let alone vote for him in the last election. So re-electing President Trump is key. And then once he's in as a legislator, I need to work to remove legislative obstacles that allow us to roll back remain in Mexico or reinstate that we turn off the catch and release mechanism that's happening now, if it even exists, if they're even catching at all.
Right.
Just turning off those incentives that allow that serve as such a magnet for illegal aliens, and then certainly build the border, actually have that physical deterrent. But when we have leadership, when we start to see deportations happening, the people that are rushing from south to north are going to pause and start to turn and say, "Whoa, wait a minute, things have changed," and that's where I'll be able to help. But also back to what you alluded to, one of the concerns: debt, generational debt, deficit, inflation. If I'm voting for omnibus spending bills that do not close our border, but only add to the debt. If I'm voting for bills whose solution is we're going to have more processing facilities at the border, that's what this last bill provided, $1.2 trillion dollars. And Chip Roy, congressman from Texas, said did nothing to secure our border. All it did was give us more processing facilities and more funds so that our border security guards can work longer hours. That's not closing the border. That's subsidizing illegal immigration. That's making it easier. Now we've got
Yeah.
more buildings, more processing capabilities to get you on through the gate. Come on through. And
Yeah.
that's not an answer that I want to be a part of.
No, and that's it. So when we look, I mean, we talk about omnibus, we talk about, I mean, continuing resolutions and the things that happen in Congress and continue on. Where do you find yourself on those? I don't want to ask you how you vote because that's a tough question because you never really know till you're in that position. But what do you see? Shut down the government? Do we keep going? Do we try to strip out what's in there after the fact? How do you see that process working out?
Yeah, great question. And I'm happy to tell you where I would vote. I will not vote for omnibus spending bills. That's not what you or anyone's hiring me to do. You're not hiring me to fund the government. You're hiring me to control spending. There are too many bureaucracies, too much of the fourth branch of government that's unaccountable to you, to me, that come with hat in hand, almost with a gun, to members of Congress and say, "You better fund me, or else." And that's not the position that you're hiring me to be in. I welcome those opportunities where I can say, "Why don't you go pound sand? We're the ones that fund you, and you can go away and do what we've asked you to do, or we can unfund you and make you so you don't exist." So for me, I'm I'm going to work so that we get back to regular order, that we have 12 appropriations bills like we're supposed to have, and that we don't wait till the last hour and stack six bills on top of another and expect the American public to say, "Yeah, you guys are acting in good faith." We have a slim majority right now, and we have too many Republicans like my opponent, Celeste Malloy, who are willing to step away from that slim majority and vote with every Democrat to pass a spending bill so that we can come home with breadcrumbs and say, "Well, we only have a slim majority, so we have to take what we can get." I argue just the opposite. You're hiring me to be that majority, slim majority, actually govern, actually say, "No, this is our budget. These are our priorities. And if you don't like it, Democrats, then you shut down the government. We're the majority. We need to govern like the majority." The American people, as you well know, American people are on our side. They just
Yeah.
want us to lead and stop caving in.
You
And
know,
boy, heaven forbid we stand up and act like a majority and actually govern.
and do something. Heaven forbid we stand up for Republican principles, because for me, yeah, I was the chairman of the Utah Republican Party, but for me, it doesn't matter which side it is. And honestly, that is why President Trump, in my opinion, is so popular. And it's not because he's a Republican. Honestly, President Trump could have won the first election running as a Democrat, and I have no doubt about that. And the reason why is President Trump doesn't care which party it is. It's not the Republicans, it's not the Democrats. It's what I think and what's right. Is he always right? No. I love President Trump. I supported him early in 16 before anybody else did. I supported him in 20, and I'll support him again in 2024. I spent time with the man. He is a phenomenal person. But is he always right? No, he's not. But not everybody can be right all the time. But with that, I think that's why it's important to note that there is change coming, and we all need to be on the same team when it comes to electing President Trump. But we have to stand up against our own party, even when we have to. And Republicans in Congress need to learn that, because in Congress, you always see, when's the last time you saw a Democrat dissent on a vote? They never do.
Yeah.
They never do, because they always vote as a block. Now, is that a great thing? No. But does it get things done? Absolutely, because they know where the rest of their party is. But we have people and dissenters within the Republican Party that, given a whim or given a reason why, they will back out and vote with the Democrats. And I'm not a big fan of that. And I like to say, it doesn't always have to be party lines. And I'll be the first one to buck the party when the party's in the wrong. But again, we have to be more strategic as Republicans and find a place to stand and stand there, because we are not. We are running away. And the Democrats, what the Democrats do, and we see this time and time again, they take a bill, they put 150% of what they want in that bill. They're more than willing to strip out that 50%, but they don't want to tell you they're going to strip out that 50%. But then they come and say, okay, let's compromise. They use the word compromise, and it's like that meme. I'm not sure the word you're saying means what you think you're saying, because when they say
Yes. Yeah.
compromise, that means we get everything that we want when we want it. And so they'll strip that 50% out, absolutely. But they still get 100% of what we want. Look at the green energy policies. Look at the inflation reduction. Look at the omnibus. I am fervently, I adamantly want to fight this, because I believe that that's where we get it wrong most of the time. And so with that, you get to Congressional District 2, and Congressional District 2, as you said, is pretty big. It takes in a bunch of the military installations in the state, but it also takes in a huge swath of public land. A lot of the mineral extraction and ranching, those things are really important in Congressional District 2. So how do we balance that? Where do you see us going with our public lands? Because for me, in the state of Utah, I see the public lands as, okay, let's take them back. I know that's going to be a long and drawn out process, but how first then do we get state control of the federal lands? And talk about water for a minute. What do you see as water problems? I mean, you hear it across the state. How do you think that you're going to go about effectuating that and make sure that our farmers, ranchers, and our mineral extraction stay on those public lands, even when the federal government doesn't want them to?
Yeah. Yeah. At the end of the day, and great, you hit all the key points. At the end of the day, those who are best equipped and best able to manage our lands are our leaders, our local leaders. And so my role as the federal representative is to break as much of that overreach from federal government away, so that our local leaders can actually govern and actually manage, actually develop, access multi-use opportunities for our land. And that begins really at the source of that begins with reelecting President Trump. So many of our county commissioners are just counting the days until we get a new director of the BLM, new
Right?
director of the EPA, and that happens when we elect Trump. And so we got to rally there first. We have to have representatives who are willing to, one, vote for President Trump, who have voted for him, and then two, work with them. And so when that happens, assuming that will happen and hoping that will happen, then that partnership that I will build with that new director of the BLM, both at the federal level and then down to our state BLM directors, we will make sure that they are, me as the federal representative, that they are completely subservient is probably the wrong word, but that they are plugged in and connected and responsive to our county commissioners, to our local leaders. And one example just right here in my backyard is the Northern Corridor. It's
Sure.
been under it's been in various stages of approval, disapproval, approval, depending on the administration for years. And it was actually green lighted, if not light green, under the Trump administration. And then Biden came in and the brakes got put on, and we've been at a standstill. So attacking projects like that, making sure that our federal bureaucracy is backing off or supportive of the priorities that we have here in our local counties, from the example of the Northern Corridor. And then there are no shortages of examples of multi-use opportunities that exist in our counties where the federal government, current federal government, has clamped down and prevented those from our local leaders from going in and exploring uh, development opportunities, both for resources, for access, and for development. Not going in and building thousands of homes and so forth, but actually developing it for the good of our communities. And that stems to both access, multi-use opportunities, water development. Those would be areas that I would want to look at. And there are parcels of land that are butted up against federal parcels that are butted up against already um, land that's been returned to the state, that I can partner with Senator Leon and others to make sure that we legislate to actually return those parcels back to state control. And the more aggressive we are with that, boy, the more we can literally return land to Utah where it should be. And then in terms of water, we certainly have the Colorado River Basin, the Colorado River Compact. As that gets negotiated, my role at the federal level would be to make sure that our leaders have that decision space without federal overreach, that I can make sure I'm that firewall pushing back on the federal overreach into where our local leaders need that space to deliberate and have decisions without federal mandates that aren't good for what we desire. Those
I,
would be
I've
areas that I would look at.
Yeah, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I mean, Reagan said it best when he said a government 3,000 miles away wants to tell you how to manage what's in your backyard. And that's what we get with the federal government. And we
Yeah,
do not have the ability. They don't give us the ability because everything in this world comes from the ground. At some point or another, anything worth of value and economic growth comes out of the dirt at one point or another. I mean, whether it's building materials, whether it's mined, whether it's drilled for, whether it's water, whether it's grazed, log, whatever it is, it comes from the ground. And the federal government locking us off of that is inhibiting our ability to grow our economy. And we as a state need to diversify our economy because we have pigeonholed ourselves into a spot where we've got a lot of eggs in one basket. And we need that ability to diversify and grow our economy. But man, when 67% of your state is owned by the federal government, it makes it completely almost impossible sometimes to be able to go through that because when it comes to resources, natural resources, man, we have an unlimited amount of that. So I truly believe, not just because I'm from the farm and ranching community, but as a Utahn, that we have the ability and we should have that opportunity to be able to manage that how we want. And again, I've said this a lot, and I said it a lot on the campaign trail that yes, we want our land back. But in the meantime, that is going to be a long and drawn out fight. But until that point in time, we as a state should push for state control of the federal lands. We saw it during COVID when they shut down the national parks and the state went in and we were running the national park. Things ran way better when the state was
yeah,
in charge because we're so much close to it. We have that grasp. But not only that, when it comes to managing our forests, I've told a lot of people this, and I might sound like a broken record, but you go look at the private land in the state of Utah, even here on our local mountains. You see where the private is butted up against the forest, and you've seen the forest management that has come off the private versus what's on the forest. It is night and day difference. They're beautifully managed forests on the private land. You know why? Because we take the time and we log them and we graze them and we manage them for better forests, for better watersheds. And that's not happening on our forest ground. It's not happening on the BLM ground. And they are wasting money and wasting resources and wasting time and valuable resources that we should be putting towards our own land and putting it elsewhere where it doesn't need to be. But we could talk about that. But I know the other thing that many talk about, and you and St. George, you guys are kind of between a rock and a hard spot because it's very hot, very dry, and water is an extremely finite resource. And the federal government controls a lot of that. We've had talks of the Lake Powell pipeline. Where do you think, for you at the federal level, where do you think you go next for St. George for water? What do you think? Do you see the Lake Powell pipeline? Do we expand our reservoir systems? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, as I've plugged in with our director of the Washington County Water Conservancy District and really seen the hard data as to how he and his team have actually had success in managing our water systems and really gathering up that secondary water that normally we just send on down the Virgin River down the line. That's truly where that success is going to come. We're going to be able to sustain potential smart growth in a not smart city growth like Governor Cox says,
Yeah.
but smarter growth in terms of having our resources. Um, the reservoir systems that they're here just in Washington County that are being built, that the capabilities to actually hold on to that secondary water and put it back into the system has been remarkable. And then just in terms of the standards for buildings, using um, just the plumbing systems that use less water, more high efficiency appliance or not appliances, but use higher efficient, more efficient use of the water that we have in our buildings has really been of a compounding effect in the water that we have available here in Washington County, despite the growth and the boom in housing
Yeah.
and building. They're actually seeing, may sound counterintuitive, but more water available as they become more efficient in the use and application of the water and the resources that require water.
No.
So me at the
Yeah.
federal level, I need to make sure that Arizona and California are not pulling from the Colorado River Water Compact allocation that we have. We don't even use what we're allocated,
That fight's
but
going
we're
to be
willing to.
ugly.
Yes, yeah, but we got to be able to bring in the federal big guns from our representatives to make sure that we keep those others away from the pot of gold of water that is ours.
Yeah, because I've told people this here in Utah, we don't have a water problem. We have a water storage problem, and everything that we can and should be storing. Yeah, I mean, when's the last time we seen a new reservoir built here in Utah? We should be building and storing reservoirs. We should be doing all those things, cutting that federal red tape to be able to. I mean, here in Sanpete County, we've had since World War II, I believe, we've been fighting over a reservoir here in the state. And every time they get close to doing it, I mean, it would store plenty of water for our valley. It would absolutely change the future of our valley. But every time they get close to it, the federals judges come in and they say, oh, we need another environmental impact study. You can't do this because of this. And the fights continue to come and come. We have to begin cutting that red tape and storing what water is ours wherever we can, however we can. And I believe that that should be a priority. But
Yes.
let's move this topic somewhere else because your area of expertise seems to be you know a lot about the local issues, but you too know a lot about the international issues and the Eastern theater over there that's going on right now in Ukraine and Israel and what's going on. I'd like to start with Ukraine, actually. What do you see the United States' job going forward with Ukraine? Because we're sending a lot of money over there. There is no oversight. We're writing blank checks to them, and we're finding out firsthand. Here's my biggest problem with this. When Trump was president, the Ukraine was the most corrupt place on the planet. Everybody said the Ukraine's corrupt, Zelensky's corrupt, they're all corrupt.
Yes.
Quid pro quo. Trump's talking to Zelensky. That place is laundering money left and right. Well, as soon as Trump is no longer president, man, everything in Ukraine's great. These are the poorest people.
Yeah.
They need our help. They need all these things. What do you see going forward with Ukraine? What should, I mean, this is real speculation, but what should our involvement in the military strategy look like in Ukraine? How should we get involved? Should we get involved? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, great questions. So two things off the top. Putin is bad. Yes, I'm not a Putin sympathizer. And then two, yeah, to your point, exactly. Ukraine is a black hole of money laundering. And it's been fascinating as I've met people. I'd say the majority of people in our district are fundamentally opposed to us sending another dollar to Ukraine, especially before we secure our own border. And that's where I land. But then I
Yeah,
have met a few, I've met a handful of, I would like to call them old Cold Warriors who still think that Red Dawn's going to happen, that Russia's knocking at our door. And if we don't do everything we can to push back on Putin, then World War III's tomorrow. And I just almost want to laugh and say, you're kidding me, right? We've sent hundreds over what almost $200 billion now, if anybody's even counting, to
right.
Ukraine.
Who's
And
who's counting?
what's the goal? What's the end? who's
Right. Well,
keeping
that's what
what's
I
the
want to
goal?
know. What does the off ramp look like? What is the
Yes,
end goal? And I
yes,
don't think we should send another dime to those guys until we say, okay, what is your plan and what is the end goal here? Because we're funding a perpetual war.
yes. And you would think we would learn from history. We're not even 2, 3 years out of Afghanistan, and the dust is it hasn't even settled. And here we are
Yeah.
dumping billions and billions of dollars, and we're just creeping towards the day when our leaders say, "Oh, well, I guess we've got to send American troops. We just got to do it." That's exactly where we're marching, and we forget that we have a NATO alliance. And I love how President Trump has come in and basically poked all of them in the chest and said, "We may not be here if you don't want this at least as bad as we do. We may not be." I'm not arguing we
Well,
leave NATO, but
no,
I'm
but we
arguing
shouldn't
that
be paying
it's
everybody's bills either with
exactly
borrowed money.
yes. It's not ours. And I personalize it in a nature that my youngest daughter is at West Point right now, and she just finished her second year. So in less than 2 years, she'll be a young lieutenant stepping into this hot mess. And when I hear Trump saying, "You guys better step up," I hear him saying, "I'm not going to send Olivia Jenkins to die in Ukraine while you French people and you Germans and everyone else could care less.
Yep.
It's not going to be the Jenkins blood in Ukraine if you guys could care less." And that's what leadership needs to be. That's where no more blank checks, like you said. There shouldn't be another dollar going. If we really cared, how many of our weapons that we've sent to Ukraine are now in Gaza? Or how many of those weapons are now in Libya and being laundered back to support guerrillas in Mali? I mean, it's a black
Well,
hole of
how much of the
unaccountability right
stuff we
now.
left in Afghanistan is now being used in Gaza? That is
Exactly.
where somebody should be held accountable. And this is where I get rubbed raw by Republicans. We all just rolled over and let that die. You don't hear
Yep.
anybody talking about the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And nobody that should be the Republicans' talking point for the next 3 months, 4 months, whatever it is till the election. Is Afghanistan, inflation, national debt, southern border. That's literally all we have to talk. But when's the last time you heard somebody talking about Afghanistan and how many people, how many weapons, all of the things, what they say, $80 billion worth of weapons we left for the Taliban and for ISIS? Like why does nobody hold them accountable? And is that what's happening in Ukraine? And I think we need answers.
Yes, that's exactly the route we're going to. There's one kind of lone wolf in Congress. His name's Congressman Mike Waltz, who just happens to be a Green Beret as well, a congressman from Florida, and he's been driving for accountability mainly because he and a handful of others have taken ownership of those Gold Star families who lost service members at Abbey Gate, and what a fiasco that was. And there's been no account report after report, no accountability. Leaders who were on the ground there have been promoted or have been retired. Just no accountability. And yeah, exactly to your point, we are going to wake up and find ourselves, if not already, in the exact same mess in Ukraine, and that's not okay. That's not okay.
Now that brings us to the next one is Israel. What you know this as well as anybody out there. Where should we be in Israel? Why are we not doing more to help? Why are we acquiescing to all of the requests of these terrorists? That's what they are. Hamas is a terrorist organization. They are not a government. They need to be removed from government. That is my opinion. They need to be wiped out because as long as they're there, Israel's going to suffer. So, what do you think our role should be in Israel? How do we support them? Should we be supporting them? Where do you think we go from here?
Yeah, two different issues there. Ukraine, no, we need that's a black hole.
Yeah.
Israel, yes, we have to stand with Israel, but we stand with them in a way where we're not undercutting them at every turn. Can you imagine Israel or any country coming to us in the wake of 9/11 and saying, you guys better, why don't you take a little easy on the Taliban? Let them,
Yeah.
maybe not be so hard on them this time. No,
Don't
and
touch al Baghdadi. Like, let's leave him
yeah,
alone.
and October 7th was 9/11 on steroids for Israel. And so, yes, we should not be building a pier off of the Gaza Strip and bringing supplies in that basically resupplies and rearms Hamas in the name of aid. That's not okay. And that's just a microcosm of when the U.S. fails to lead on the international stage like we are, then the world burns. When in the wake of October 7th, when Biden made his first trip over there, he was supposed to meet with the King of Jordan when he landed. But while he was airborne, the king of Jordan literally gave him the middle finger and said, I'm not meeting with you. And when Biden landed, he didn't meet with the king of, and the king of Jordan is a great friend and ally to the U.S. We
Yeah.
we've trained him. I've been in Jordan where special ops have. We've built facilities there where we've had changes and trainings. So for the king of Jordan, who's since reconnected with Biden, but boy, when we needed leadership, the world just thumbed their nose at us because we don't matter anymore,
No.
and that needs to change.
You know, and Zenke from Montana said it once. I was listening to him speaking at an event, and he said it once, and he says, "You know what? Here's the deal: when the United States stumbles, nations fall." And I truly believe that everybody's looking to the United States right now, and honestly, the world's laughing at us. Whereas 3 years ago, under President Trump, we were a superpower. We were where we were meant to be. The strategic oil reserves were full. Our
Yes.
military is as strong as they've been in 20 years. We have been investing in places. Yes, he spent a lot of money, and I don't give him a pass for that, but he was spending it in places that we needed to spend it in that had been undermined and undercut for the last 20 years. And so, with that, we had peace in the Middle East. We had the Abraham Accords. You had peace breaking out all over the world. And yet now, the wolves are at the door and everybody's licking their chops, and we look to the west and we look to the east, and you've got China, you've got Russia, and everybody's just pushing on us. So I mean, that brings us to I mean, let's still talk about Israel for a second, and then I want to go to China, because I know we're talking military strategy, but this is what a lot of people want to know is, yes, in Israel, what is the end goal? What do you think the end goal should be in Israel? Where do they stop? Where do we support them? And then we'll talk about China a little bit.
Yeah. So the end goal should be, and we should support them with Hamas not existing. And unfortunately, that's the civilian casualties and deaths that happen in the Gaza Strip are 100% on Hamas. Now, Israel has made mistakes for sure. War is terrible, and there will be fratricide and loss of human life. But every life that's lost there is on Hamas.
Yeah,
And back to your point, American leadership, when we stumble, civilizations fall, but American citizens are put at jeopardy. We have Americans that are still hostage there. Can you imagine when Biden went over that for that first trip? He should have looked squarely in the camera and said, "If you harm a hair on the head of one of our Americans that are in your that you've captured, then heaven help us." And that didn't happen. And there's still Americans that are held hostage. That's how does that happen? Can you imagine Reagan walking away from that?
right.
That's not okay. And
But I
so as
mean,
long as
look
that's
back
still
to what
happening,
Trump said to Putin. He told him when he was president, he says, "You don't step into Ukraine. As long as I'm the
yeah, and he
president, you
didn't.
don't touch." And
Yeah,
he never did. The second
yeah,
Trump's gone, man, that weakness and that lack of leadership shows. And there is a leadership vacuum across our nation and across the world right now that people are looking for strong leaders.
yes. And I feel that in my race is one example of that, where you have my opponent who is comfortable saying, "Hey, I'll vote with every Democrat and I'll just take what I can get." Instead of saying, "No, you hired me to govern. You hired me to stand with our slim majority, not leave it every chance I can get. You actually hired me to lead, to have courage, have confidence, to actually stand up instead of getting rolled over, bulldozed at every key vote." And that's what needs to happen for my district and the opportunity that we have before us in my race.
Yeah, no, and let's not to keep it on military forever, but I think it's important to note when we talk about military, I don't think we can talk about it without talking about China. Yeah, they might not be a problem at this moment in time, but they soon will be, in my opinion. What should be our strategy with China? What do you see the United States' relationship with China, and where should we put ourselves as far as trade and military goes?
Yeah, where to begin there? And I have a unique perspective. My military assignment, one assignment ago, I was the deputy chief of staff in Hawaii at the Special Operations Command for the Pacific Theater. So I'm in the reserves still. I'm a colonel serving in the reserve. I'm not active duty, but I do duty every now and then and weeks at a time or weekend here or there. So so SOCPAC, as it's called, Special Operations Command Pacific, over there we eat, sleep, and breathe China, and we forget how big the Pacific Ocean is, and we think that that we can react like that. Well, we can't. It's a big ocean, it's a big problem, and China is eating our lunch in the Pacific Ocean. There was one example of where we had a US flag ship try and do a port call, regular port call in one of the Cook Islands, and was turned away under the American flag.
Oof.
And as we come to find out, not too long before that scheduled port call, a Chinese fleet had flown in or had made its own port call and had literally just shelled out the dough and said, "This is now ours." And they're just quietly overtaking the Pacific theater, building islands out of the ocean, building those launch platforms. And then along our southern border, we don't even have to go to the Pacific to see the influence of China. China sees our southern border as the smokeless battlefield. They don't even have to pull a trigger to kill Americans by the tens of thousands because China already has pipelines built of bringing the precursors for fentanyl into the possession of the cartels. The cartels then convert it to fentanyl and infiltrate it into our country. And the number one cause of death for our youth is drug overdose from fentanyl. Well, guess
Yeah.
who's providing that? The Chinese just sit back and laugh. They love our open border. And now you can go on Twitter, you can go on anything and see there are military age Chinese men coming across the border by the thousands now. And that does not happen by chance.
No, but
So yeah,
we don't even have to go to the southern border. Look at what they've done here in the state. Look at what the Chinese own here in the state of Utah. Look at what they
yes,
did during COVID. People don't want to talk about what happened during COVID, but the Chinese bought up grain elevators along the Mississippi River, vital parts of our agricultural infrastructure along the Mississippi River during COVID. At last I had checked, it was somewhere around 31 or 32 grain elevators that they had bought up during COVID. Well, not only that, but look what they own in the state. Look how much agricultural land.
yes,
Prime example, go to Beaver County. That's in your
yeah,
district. I mean, you
yep,
can't talk about the Chinese without talking about Smithfield and the WH group a couple of years ago. For background, for those who don't know, in Beaver County here in Utah, the WH group come in a few years ago. It's a Chinese conglomerate. They come in and they bought up Smithfield. Well, they put a lot of money into infrastructure. They invest heavily. And this is not the first time the Chinese have done this. And this is an absolutely a strategic way to take over our food supply. They come in, they buy up the infrastructure, they invest heavily, they put all the small people out of business, and then they shut it down. They have a history of doing this across the United States, and nobody stops them. Nobody talks about that. And this is a national security risk that nobody's talking about.
yes.
They shut down 1/5 of the pork processing here in the United States overnight. The Chinese were able to take out 1/5.
Mm.
This is asinine. This is national security risk. No other countries allow for this. I don't know of a single other country that will allow foreign entities to buy up their agricultural infrastructure and their ground within the country. And yet we as Americans, we just sit there and let it happen. And so do you believe that that is a problem? And how do you say that we deal with it?
Yeah, definitely it is a problem. And it's a matter of perspective. China, like the Taliban, they have nothing but time on their hands. They think in terms of dynasties or centuries,
Yeah.
whereas we look in what can happen to now, tomorrow. And so they're like you alluded to, they are patiently, deliberately building out their infrastructure so that they can have immediate negative impact when it's needed. And so that they'll quietly do that until we wake up and or that frog in the burning pot, if you will. The water is now boiling and we don't know how we are still in this boiling water. And so how we fix that is sound like a broken record. We elect President Trump back again. We make
Yeah.
sure that we have strong leadership on the international stage. We make sure that our military is not a social experiment, that it's actually ready, it's actually equipped and funded and appropriated and trained so that it can project force across that huge Pacific theater and not be at the whims of whatever transgender social experiment is needing to be conducted in the military. That hurts
Yeah.
us at every corner.
No, and I truly think you're absolutely right. And when we talk about China and we talk about agriculture, I don't think we can talk about either of these two things without talking about tariffs and talking about the Trump era tariffs and what happened during the Trump administration. When Trump imposed tariffs, everybody was telling him not to. And kudos to Trump and kudos to Lighthizer and the people he had on his trade team that made that decision, because it has proven to be absolutely correct. Yeah, it was tough in the beginning, and he told everybody that. He says it's going to be hard, and yet now we are so much further ahead. And I truly believe that tariffs are what are going to protect our country from predatory nations, and not only that, friendly nations who continue to take advantage of the United States. So over the last couple of years through Senate Finance and House Ways and Means, you have seen more tariff bills instituted over the last year than I believe we've seen in the last 30 years. So do you think that tariffs are the way forward for the United States? Do you think we should be adding tariffs to other countries besides China? Should we be putting tariff and taxes on everything else? How do we adjust for inflation? What do you think on that matter?
Yeah, tariffs are definitely tricky. Like you said, I gained the endorsement of Senator Rand Paul, and he would argue that tariffs are bad. That
Yeah.
any tariff that's imposed just passes the cost expense down to the consumer, or causes the product to be inferior. So it is tricky, but I agree with what you alluded to earlier. When there are predatory actions, when there are countries that are just completely undercutting any American industrial advantage or opportunity, then we need to come. I hate the idea of the government leveling the playing field or picking winners and choosers. That's or winners and losers. That's not what the government should be in the business of. But there are instances where, like China and other countries, where we just completely are at a disadvantage, and there needs to be some leveling via tariff tools and other um, measures that are at our disposal in order to make sure that we're at least in the same ballpark to compete and play. Because too often we're not even in the parking lot, and so
No,
we need to be able
and
to do
we
that.
see that firsthand in agriculture. I probably sound like a broken record the same, but we're trying to compete with other countries who don't have the same laws that we have. They don't have the
Yeah,
same standards that we are, yet they can ship a product here to the United States. They can label it product of the United States even. We can't even get country of origin labeling to tell people, hey, this is where this is coming from, because the big
wow.
packers, they fight us on it constantly. 80% of the beef industry, they're ran by, I would akin it to the cartels. I mean, these four big companies that own 80% of the beef industry, a lot of them are foreign owned. And yet we continue to acquiesce to those guys. We can't get trade laws in place, and they want us to play by the rules, but yet we're playing with two hands tied behind our back. And this is where Senator Lee and I argue quite frequently about tariffs, is that, you know what, we have to protect domestic industry, especially in the agricultural sector, because food security is national security. And as of 2019, for the first time in the history of the United States, we became a net importer of agricultural commodities. And the fact that we are dependent on other countries to feed our people is an absolute joke. And I mean, this is not by design, and this is happening on purpose. And call me a conspiracy theorist, call me whatever you'd like, but this is being done on purpose. And why? Because we do it better than anybody else. People want proper practices, they want proper environmental practices. Well, yeah, we're doing it, but guess what? These other countries, they're not. And
Yeah.
yet we're made to play on the same playing field as those. And I think it's high time that we start instituting a tariff rate quota and say, hey, this is what we produce in the United States every year. This is what we have the capacity to produce every year. And until we use that capacity, we're not importing anything else, or we're going to do it. You have X amount you can import every year. Once you go beyond that, that's on you, and we're going to charge you for it.
Yeah, that seems like a reasonable idea. I haven't explored that, but we need to give our American producers, our American agriculture industry, every advantage and every opportunity to compete, let alone compete fairly.
Yeah. And two, yeah, it may cost a little bit more, but I'd rather have food that costs just a little bit more to the end consumer and have food on the table than depend on these other countries, because especially when it comes to produce, especially, I mean, they talk about the things that we have to meet, the environmental standards and all the FDA that we are being forced on. It doesn't exist in these other countries. And
Yes.
And I asked them once. We were talking to some members of Congress from another state, and I asked them flat out. They say, "Well, anything brought to the United States has to meet FDA standards." I said, "Okay, so are you inspecting these plants in these kill plants in other countries that are processing this food?" And they said, "Well, sometimes." So sometimes, what does that mean? Because here in the United States, you have to have an FDA inspector at all times on the floor. If you're going to process things, you have to be an FDA inspected facility. So are these other countries FDA inspected? Are they, I mean, during COVID, this is where I get real fired up because during COVID, we had a backlog of beef that we couldn't get processed here in the United States. What do? They go import beef from Zambia. We don't know how that is being processed. We have no idea. Yet we can't produce our own, but we're putting American dollars. Let's just be completely honest about what's happening here. We are taking American dollars, we are subsidizing industry and growing industries in other countries to ship back to the United States to make our government is paying other countries to compete with our farmers and ranchers. Not only that, but our other sectors as well. This is happening. There is a vote coming for it here before long, and I'll tell you what, I'll be watching closely.
Yeah, yeah, that's not it, and that same approach is what we're doing with terrorism. We are paying the Taliban millions of dollars every month, if not every week, to keep them afloat. And what are they doing? They're allowing ISIS, Al Qaeda, our tried and true uh, enemies, to set up training camps. And where do we think the Hamas fighters were trained before they went into Israel? In Afghanistan, under the nose of the Taliban, with the support of the Taliban, using our millions of dollars.
Yeah. And using our military equipment to do it at the same
Yeah,
time.
using our everything. Yeah,
And
that's you can't make it up.
all the while, we're borrowing money on our children's heads from other countries to be able to fund it and give it to somebody else.
Yes, but Carson,
It's,
you and I know we can and will do better, and that's
yeah,
coming full circle. That's why we're talking. That's why I'm in this race because I know that our second congressional seat can have a positive impact in that. Our seat right now is it's getting bulldozed. It's voting with every Democrat in terms of funding. It's voting against individual liberties in support of FISA and warrantless wiretaps on Americans. That's not what America's about, and that's enough is enough. Business
yeah,
as usual needs to stop, and
yeah.
that's why I'm here.
But an informed public is what's going to hold people accountable. And the more we talk about it, the more we have these conversations. But the public needs to be aware and they need to hold people accountable for what they do. And that's why we do what we do is give everybody the information, let them make an informed decision. So with that, we're running short on time. Colby, you want to leave everybody one, where do we find you? How do they learn more about you? And two, kind of give them your final appeal. Why you going into this primary?
Okay, thank you, Carson, and thanks again for this opportunity. Great to catch up with you and
Sure, it's
talk
been
about these
great.
important, yeah, these important issues. I appreciate it. So our website is Colby for Utah, FOR Utah at COLBY Utah.com. And on our website, we've got no shortage of podcast interviews, testimonials of people who've served with me in combat. I actually have a testimonial from one of my soldiers who talks about when we were shot down in a helicopter in Afghanistan and all that happened there. So some fascinating stories there. We have a testimonial from one of the Americans that was hostage in the jungles of Colombia that I worked to help rescue. So some great material there for people to take a look at. But then ultimately, why me? Well, for me and what you're going to get from me, you're going to get from me what you've already gotten for 31 years. 31 years ago is when I swore an oath to support and defend our Constitution. And no one has relieved me of that oath, nor will they. And I still wear the patch on my shoulder. I still serve this nation. So that attitude of service, of truly knowing that the Constitution is something that I've sworn an oath to, not to a person, but to our Constitution. So when you vote for me and our team, that's what you're going to get. Unfettered, tried and true defense of our Constitution. And that also includes standing up for conservative Republican values that are continued to be compromised on at every turn by my opponent. Enough is enough. You're going to get from me someone who will vote with courage, who's not afraid to say no, so that I can say yes to lower debt, to lower spending, to actually having a budget and an agenda that reflects our values, not the values of the Democrats who vote every time together and just look for a few Republicans to join them. That's not what you're going to get from me. And so that's why we're in the race and hoping that we have and knowing that we'll have a great victory next Tuesday on the 25th. You know, keep in mind we've already won twice during this race. I beat my opponent head to head by double digits here in Washington County when we were both in person, and I beat her at the state convention by 14%. So that those who are paying attention, the delegates, they've seen the issues and they've voted on behalf of our constituents. And now we're just scaling that message so that more and more people can understand why we've already won and why we need to continue to win. So thanks,
No.
Carson, for your time and working with Senator Lee. Mike Lee's been endorsing me and helping Rand Paul on the House side. The House Freedom Fund has endorsed me, which is interesting, endorsing me against an incumbent Republican because they see what's at stake. So it's great to have people who think and vote like I want to vote and how I will vote, stand up and get in our corner as well.
No, and thanks for joining me. Thanks for taking the time. It's good to see you again. And thank you everybody else for joining us. Thanks for listening, taking the time to learn, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye now.